Right now, as you are watching this, the odds are surprisingly high, perhaps as high as 85%, that you are holding a cup of coffee, have just finished one, or are about to make one. But have you ever actually stopped to ask a simple question? Where did this drink begin? Hundreds of millions of people, quite possibly more than 1 billion, drink coffee every single day on every continent on Earth. It is a daily ritual we perform without a second thought. But did you know that this ordinary drink was once put on trial and banned outright? Or that the word mocha, which millions of people say without thinking, is really the name of a small port town on the coast of Arabia? The story behind your morning cup is far stranger and far older than you might imagine. It is, when you think about it, a strange habit. We take the seed of a particular fruit, dry it, roast it until it is nearly burnt, grind it to powder, pour hot water through it, and drink the bitter, dark liquid that comes out. Nobody, looking at the raw red berry on the branch, would ever guess that inside it lay something that would reshape the rhythm of human life. Because coffee did not just give people a drink, it changed how they worked, how they met, how they talked, and even how they thought. It built fortunes and cities. It created an entirely new kind of public space. It fed trade routes that reached around the globe. Today, it is one of the most heavily traded commodities on Earth. By some measures, only crude oil moves across the world in greater volume. This unassuming brown drink sits near the very top of the list of things human beings buy and sell. And the whole story begins in one specific place. Not a great empire or a famous capital, but the mountains of Yemen, on the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula. This is the story of how a single bitter seed from one corner of Arabia ended up in the hands and the mornings of almost the entire human race. Let us start with a puzzle, because the origins of coffee sit right on the line between history and legend. The coffee plant itself is not, in fact, native to Yemen. Botanists trace the wild plant to the highlands of East Africa, in what is now Ethiopia, where it grew on its own long before anyone thought to make a drink of it. And there is a famous story about how its powers were first discovered. As the tale is told, a goat herder noticed that his goats became strangely lively, almost dancing, after eating the berries of a certain shrub. Curious, he tried the berries himself and felt the same jolt of energy. It is a charming story. It is also, almost certainly, a legend, written down centuries after the fact, with no way to know if any of it really happened. We simply do not have a reliable record of the exact moment coffee was discovered. What we can say with more confidence is this: the plant may have come from Africa, but the drink, coffee as we would recognize it, was born across the narrow sea, in Yemen. It was there that people first took the bean, roasted it, ground it, and brewed it into a beverage. And there that it first became part of a culture. Exactly how the plant made the short crossing from Africa to Arabia, and exactly when, is not something we can pin down. But once it reached Yemen, something changed. People there did not merely eat the berry. They worked out how to turn it into a drink. And the first people to embrace it were not merchants or kings. They were men looking for a way to stay awake through the night. In the Yemen of roughly the 15th century, coffee found its first real home among the Sufis, the mystics of the Muslim world. The Sufi orders held long sessions of worship and remembrance that stretched deep into the night, and staying awake and alert through those hours was a genuine challenge. Coffee was the answer. It kept the mind clear and held off sleep, and so it became bound up with devotion, a help for prayer and concentration in the long, dark hours. By tradition, it was a Sufi scholar who did much to bring the drink into these circles, and from the prayer hall, it spread outward. What had begun as an aid to worship quickly became something people wanted simply for its own sake. for the alertness, the warmth, the small daily pleasure of it. Coffee moved out of the place of worship and into the street. It became a habit, then a fashion, then a fixture of ordinary life across Yemen. People drank it at home, they drank it with guests, they drank it to work and to talk. Even the name traveled. The Arabic word for the drink, kahwa, would move with it from language to language, becoming kahve in Turkish, and eventually the coffee and the cafe of a dozen European tongues. The very word most of the world uses still carries its Arabian roots inside it. A local custom had been born, and it was about to turn one Yemeni port into the coffee capital of the entire world. On the Red Sea coast of Yemen stood a port town called Al-Makka, a name that English speakers would come to pronounce as Mocha. As the taste for coffee spread beyond Yemen into the wider Ottoman world and eventually toward Europe, demand exploded, and it all flowed through this one harbor. For roughly 2 centuries, Yemen held something close to a total monopoly on the world's coffee. Almost nowhere else grew it commercially. Almost no other port shipped it. If you wanted coffee anywhere on earth, it very likely passed through Mocha. For a time, Mocha was one of the busiest trading ports on the Red Sea, crowded with ships come from Cairo, from the Ottoman heartlands, from Persia and India, all after the same dark cargo. A small town on a hot, dry coast had become, improbably, a hinge of world commerce. The name stuck so hard to the trade that centuries later, and half a world away, we still use the word mocha for a kind of coffee. Most people never suspecting that they are naming a small port on the coast of Yemen. And the Yemenis understood exactly what they had and moved to protect it. They were glad to sell the world all the coffee it could drink, but they were determined that no one else should ever grow it. So, according to the accounts, they let the beans leave only after they had been treated, boiled or roasted, so that the seed could no longer sprout. You could buy the coffee, you could not buy the plant. For generations, that clever precaution held. The secret of coffee stayed locked inside Arabia. But a secret that valuable does not stay locked forever. Before we follow the bean out of Arabia, we have to talk about the most important thing coffee created, aside from the drink itself: the coffee house. As coffee spread through the great cities of the Ottoman world, Mecca, Cairo, Istanbul, a new kind of place appeared alongside it. Not a tavern, not a private home, but a public house dedicated to this one drink, where a person could sit for the price of a cup for as long as they liked. This was something genuinely new. Here were spaces where people of different backgrounds could gather, meet, and simply talk. They discussed news and business. They played games like chess and backgammon. They listened to music and to storytellers. They argued about poetry and about the events of the day. The coffee house became a center of social life, a place to trade information and ideas in a way that had not quite existed before. It is hard to overstate how influential this idea would prove to be. The coffee house, as a social institution, would travel with the drink wherever it went, and everywhere it landed, it did the same thing. It gave people a place to gather and talk. And in some places, the coffee house became so bound up with news and trade that whole institutions grew out of it. In London, one famous coffee house, where merchants and ship owners gathered to swap news of voyages and share the risks of the sea, slowly grew into one of the most famous insurance markets in the world. The humble cup, it turned out, could give birth to an empire of business. But a place where people gathered to talk freely was not something every authority welcomed. Any powerful new thing entering a society tends to provoke a reaction. and coffee was no exception. As the drink and its houses spread, they drew suspicion. Some worried about the effects of this potent new stimulant on the body and the mind. Others were uneasy about the coffee houses themselves, about crowds of people gathering, talking, and mixing outside the usual settings of home and market. A place full of people freely exchanging opinions can look, to those in authority, like a place where trouble is brewed along with the coffee. And so there were attempts to control it. In one well-known episode, around the year 1511, an official in Mecca moved to ban coffee and close the coffee houses. And there were debates among scholars over whether the drink should be permitted at all. But the bans never held for long. Coffee was simply too popular, too useful, and too pleasant. Wherever it was restricted, the restriction tended to be reversed before long, and the cups came back out. The drink had already sunk too deep into daily life to be pulled out of it again. And there was another side to the story, too. Some rulers came to see the coffeehouse not as a threat, but as a source of taxes and a sign of a thriving city. The relationship between coffee and authority was never simply one of banning. It was a long negotiation between a popular new pleasure and the people who governed. Coffee had won its argument in the Arab and Ottoman world, and now it was ready to cross into a new one. In the 17th century, coffee arrived in Europe. It came at first, the way so much did in that age, through trade with the Ottoman world. European merchants, and the Venetians above all, carried it across the Mediterranean, and slowly, curious Europeans acquired the taste. Around the middle of the century, the first coffee houses opened on the continent, and then in England, and the idea caught fire. And the institution traveled with the drink, exactly as it had in the East. European coffee houses became busy centers of conversation, news, and business. So much so that in some cities they turned into informal hubs of commerce and debate, places where merchants struck deals and where the newest ideas were argued over a cup. A whole culture of public discussion grew up around the drink, in a Europe that was, at that very moment, entering an age of new ideas. Coffee, in other words, did the same work in Europe that it had done in Arabia. It woke people up, and it gave them somewhere to gather and think. There was a quiet transformation underneath this. Through much of a European day, the ordinary drink had often been weak beer or watered wine, even in the morning. A hot, clearing, energizing drink was something genuinely new, and it arrived just as a more disciplined, clock-driven world of work was taking shape. Coffee and the modern working day, in a sense, grew up together. But there was still one problem for these new coffee-drinking nations. They did not control the source. Every bean still came at a steep price through Arabia, and they were determined to change that. The Yemeni monopoly had rested on a single fact. No one else possessed a living coffee plant. Break that, and the whole arrangement would collapse. And in time, it broke. There is a famous story of a pilgrim who, returning home from Mecca to India, is said to have carried a small handful of fertile coffee seeds away with him, hidden on his person, defying the ban on live beans. Whether the details are exactly true or not, seeds like these did eventually make it out of Arabia. And once a single living plant could be grown elsewhere, the monopoly's days were numbered. One French naval officer, as the story is told, carried a single precious seedling across the Atlantic by ship, guarding it through storms and a shortage of drinking water, reportedly sharing his own ration with the little plant, until he could set it in the ground on a Caribbean island. From cuttings like that one, whole plantations, and in time, whole national economies would grow. The European trading powers seized the opening. The Dutch obtained live plants and began growing coffee in their tropical colony on the island of Java in what is now Indonesia. From a treasured plant nurtured in Europe, the French carried coffee to their islands in the Caribbean. Others took it onward until it eventually reached the vast, ideal growing lands of South America. Within a few decades, coffee was no longer an Arabian secret. It was a global crop grown across a belt of tropical countries around the world. Yemen's monopoly was over, and the little port of Mocha slipped from the center of the trade toward its edge. Coffee had gone global. But the way it was now being produced carried a darkness that the drink's pleasant image has often hidden. It matters, in telling the bright story of coffee, not to skip the dark chapter, because it is a real part of how the drink conquered the world. As coffee became a mass commodity, grown on enormous plantations in European colonies, it created an enormous demand for labor. Hard, relentless labor, in hot fields far from the comfortable coffee houses of Europe. And a great deal of that demand was met through forced labor and enslaved people. On the plantations of the Caribbean and the Americas in the 17th and 18th centuries, much of the world's coffee came to be produced by enslaved workers, laboring under brutal conditions. At the height of this system, a single colony in the Caribbean was supplying a large share of all the world's coffee, and it did so on the backs of people held in bondage and worked without mercy. This is not a detail to be smoothed over. The wealth this produced was staggering, and so was the human cost hidden behind it. When people later marveled at the riches these colonies generated, they were describing, whether they admitted it or not, the output of forced labor on an enormous scale. The comfortable European ritual of the morning cup and the vast profits of the coffee trade were built for a long and terrible period on the suffering of people who never chose any part of it. The bean that had begun as a help to prayer in the mountains of Yemen had become, in other hands, an engine of both fortune and cruelty. That, too, is part of its journey. Step back and look at what this one bean had done to the shape of human life. Coffee changed the rhythm of the day itself. The idea of pausing work for a cup, of starting the morning with one, of meeting a friend or a colleague over one. All of it became woven into the ordinary texture of life across much of the world. In an age of factories and offices, a drink that kept people alert and focused suited the new world perfectly. And it became part of how modern work itself got done. There is a simple reason it fits so well. The bean contains caffeine, a mild stimulant, and unlike many other pleasures, it tends to sharpen the mind rather than cloud it. A drink that left you more alert, more sociable, and more able to work was almost perfectly designed to spread through a busy world. And around the bean grew one of the largest trades on Earth. Coffee became a global commodity worth staggering sums, grown by millions of farmers in dozens of countries, shipped across oceans, and sold in the end on almost every street corner in the world. From the mystic's prayer hall to the merchant's counting house to the modern coffee shop, the drink kept doing the same essential thing: gathering people and waking them up. Few single products have ever spread so far or lodged themselves so deeply into daily human habit. And through all of it, quietly in the background, stood a small mountain country on the edge of Arabia, where it had all begun. Here is what is remarkable about the whole story. It was not driven by an empire or a conquest or a war. It was driven by a taste. A small, bitter seed that happened to keep people awake, and happened to taste good enough that once they had tried it, they did not want to stop. From the highlands of Africa to the mountains of Yemen, From the coffee houses of Cairo and Istanbul to the trading cities of Europe, and out to plantations on the far side of the world, coffee traveled further and touched more ordinary lives than most of the mighty kings and armies of its age. And though the plant is now grown almost everywhere warm enough to hold it, the memory of where the drink truly began has not entirely faded. It survives in a single word, still spoken every day by people who have no idea what they are saying. Mocha, the name of a small Yemeni port carried around the world in a cup. So the next time you hold one, consider what you are actually holding. Not just a drink, but the end point of a journey that began centuries ago on a mountainside in Yemen with a handful of people looking for a way to stay awake.